Turning points change the course of our lives, whether it's a big decision, overcoming an obstacle or tragedy, or taking a leap of faith. These stories of inspiration and resilience are what Turning Point is all about. Hi everyone, and welcome to the final episode of season 1 of Turning Point. After this, we're taking a little break to regroup and reset. We will be back with season 2 in the fall. Of course, I'll keep you all posted on the launch date for that on social media. Over the course of this season, a lot of people have mentioned that I should really share my own turning point. And until now, I've been a bit hesitant. I think some of it stems from what I was taught as a journalist, which is that you yourself should never be the story. I love hearing other people's stories, so that has felt natural. But let's be honest, it's also really vulnerable to ask people to share their stories. I know, I do it all the time. But I've been nervous about being vulnerable about some of my own experiences. All of that being said, I do think it's time. I do want to share some of the things I've experienced. And aside from hearing from guests that I should share my own turning point, a lot of my reason for doing this is also for the young women of color who have asked me for advice about journalism. I never want to lie or mislead any of them. I take my role as a mentor very seriously. And I do feel a responsibility to be honest about some of the really challenging experiences I had in the industry, which eventually, quite frankly, led me to leave. So I knew I couldn't really interview myself. So joining us today is one of my very good friends, Camille Dundas. Camille is a racial equity consultant and the co-founder and editor-in-chief of BuyBlacks.com, Canada's #1 Black online magazine. And before that, she also worked at CBC and CTV. Thanks so much for being here, Cam.
Thank you for having me, Priya.
So just so everyone knows, until recently, Camille and I also worked at Hootsuite together. And Cam, you really came into my life at a pivotal moment when I was looking for a new career path. So with that, I'm going to hand the controls over to you.
Oh my gosh, I got the control. I got the power, Priya. How are you?
All the power, it's all yours. This feels very strange.
Yeah, what is this role reversal doing to you right now? Are you okay? Are you going to make it?
You know what? I feel a little nervous. I'm not going to lie. I'm used to being in the driver's seat and used to asking other people to be vulnerable. So it does feel a little strange.
Yeah. Well, our friendship story, I think, really took off when you reached out and said, hey, what's that Hootsuite thing all about? And we met for lunch and we talked a bit and things got rolling from there. But I want to back up from that and start at the beginning. Tell us what led you to a career in journalism. And I don't think I've even ever asked you that. So I'm interested.
It's funny. When I was little, I always loved writing. I loved public speaking. But I always had it kind of in my head that I wanted to be a teacher. And it was actually my dad who really talked to me about journalism. He was very interested in journalism himself. He actually volunteered at a community cable station in Regina, Saskatchewan, where I grew up. So he himself had an interest in journalism. Because of that, I, was always kind of up to date on current events and reading the newspaper. And then as I was in high school and kind of starting to think about what I was going to do next, he's the one who really brought it to my attention that, all of these things that you love doing, this kind, a little bit of social activism, writing, public speaking, and sharing information with other people, all of those things are what journalism is. So that's kind of where the initial interest came from.
So then you did follow teaching for a little while, right?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad in media, information, and technoculture at the University of Western Ontario. And I also did, the program actually offered a degree and a diploma at the same time. So I also studied broadcast journalism at Fanshawe College. And I absolutely loved it. But I did still have this interest in teaching. And after my undergrad, I think a lot of people go through this where you kind of you're not 100% sure what you want to do, and maybe you want to try something different. That's the boat I was in. So what I really wanted to do was take a year off and travel. But it's hard to do that when you have a student loan and no money in your bank account.
Right. So where does that detour take you then?
So what I decided to do was go to South Korea and teach English. I figured it's going to give me this opportunity to travel, but I can also work. So I'm going to make money at the same time. And my whole plan was to go there for a year and then come back and do my master's in journalism somewhere in Canada. But I loved it so much. I ended up actually staying for 6 years.
Wow.
So I taught English. I traveled all over Asia. I spent some time traveling in Europe as well. It was such an incredible experience.
Wow, but journalism was still calling your name. So then when you came back, what happened?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I did do, a little bit of writing while I was away. I did a little bit of work at a radio station at one point while I was in Korea. But yes, after those 6 years, I really decided, you know what, I still have that passion. I want to get back to journalism. So then I ended up applying for master's programs, and I decided to go to the University of King's College at Dalhousie in Halifax. They had an investigative journalism program, and that really piqued my interest. I loved the idea of I guess that social justice aspect really interested me still. And I liked the idea of doing more in-depth stories, more investigative type work. So I had no connection at all to Halifax, but I'd heard great things about the journalism programs, especially the undergrad program was very well known at King's. So I took a bit of a chance and ended up in Halifax there.
So then you graduate from this master's program. What's your first job and what was it like?
Yes. So this is 2013 when I started the master's program. And at the end of that year, I was starting to look for volunteer opportunities. Until that point, I wasn't 100% sure about what kind of journalism I wanted to do. Did I want to work at a newspaper or in radio or in TV? So as I was kind of figuring this out, one of the courses I did in my master's program was a digital reporting class where we did do a lot of video and more TV style reporting. So that's when I really kind of decided I think that's what I'd like to pursue. So I started looking for volunteer opportunities at a local station in Halifax. So at this point, I was about halfway through my master's. I reached out to the news director at CTV Atlantic, and didn't hear back, but kept being persistent. And eventually he got back to me and said he had something for me. And I thought at this point, great, I'm going to get to volunteer. But it was actually a part-time job. And basically I was a newsroom assistant. So I would, during the live broadcasts, I was in the control room rolling the teleprompter. I would print scripts for the anchors. I would answer phones, deliver messages and news tips to the right people. It was such a great experience because, I think when you're studying as a journalist and you think about TV, you think about being on camera a lot of the time, but it really gave me an appreciation for everything that happens in the background, all of the work of the writers, the producers, the people like my role who you're rolling the teleprompter and printing scripts. I was really excited to get that behind the scenes experience. And I have to say there were some of the most stressful moments when there was a 5 o'clock show and a 6 o'clock show. And during the last commercial break of the 5 o'clock show, you'd have to run out. So print the scripts for the 6 o'clock show, run to the printer, pick them up, and then deliver them to the 6 o'clock anchor desk. And if that printer broke, which it often did, I have never sweat so much in my life. It was very stressful, but very good experience.
I don't think newsroom assistants even exist anymore. Is that still a role? I feel like it's not a role anymore.
That is a very good question. I don't know if a lot of newsrooms have that position.
Because when I was a writer, I would run the scripts to the studio.
Yeah. And at a lot of stations now too, the anchors even roll the teleprompters
That's what I'm
themselves.
thinking. So I don't even think that role might be obsolete now. So wow. So you're working behind the scenes, you're shadowing reporters, and then, what happens next? How did you get in past that assistant job? How did you continue?
Yeah. So, I would come in on my days off. So at the time, I was also working at a clothing store. So I worked part time at this clothing store. I was doing my master's. I was working part time as a newsroom assistant, and then whenever I had a day off, I would try to come in and shadow one of the other reporters at CTV Atlantic. And a lot of them were just so wonderful and would let me tag along with them for the day. And then what I would do is come back and put together my own version of their story. And then I would send it to the producers and one of the anchors there, Steve Murphy, he's still there. He's the 6 o'clock anchor, and he was, one of my best mentors. And I would send it to him and some of the producers and just ask them to start giving me feedback. So I really was trying to show them that, I was eager, I was excited, that I really wanted a chance to be on air.
Okay,
and eventually,
I need to pause there because people need to meditate on the fact that you came in on your day off, did basically a whole day of work for free by gathering the story alongside the reporter and then putting it together just to get feedback. That is really important for people to hear, the type of input that you have to expend when you are trying to build your career in media, because it is competitive and tough.
It really is. And, at the time that I started there were a lot of young people like me who were, either just out of school or just finishing up school and who were really trying to get their foot in the door. So I feel like you really had to do anything you could to try and kind of set yourself apart and get that experience. And a lot of times after school, people will move to really small markets, which is another great way to get started. But I think if you're in more of a mid-sized market like Halifax, it's a little bit harder just to kind of get that first on-air opportunity. So this was my way of trying to work around the system a little bit.
Working that system. So you're coming in on your days off, doing stories, getting feedback. So did that result? Did you get the desired result? Did you end up getting an actual job after all of that?
Yeah. So the first thing that happened was that eventually a reporter was going on vacation, and lucky for me, there was no one else to fill in for them. so that was
there's no one else,
right? So that was my big chance. So yeah, so
that's how I got my first breaking news story, was because there was literally no one else in the newsroom. They're like, okay, well, guess you're going.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's like what that whole saying about when preparedness meets opportunity, right? So yeah. So it was actually a full week. I got to fill in for this reporter, and I felt very, it was a kind of sink or swim situation, and it worked out really well. And after that, I was able to backfill for some of the other reporters when they were on vacation. I started doing the weather on the weekends. That was kind of my next step. And then eventually I also was anchoring the late night news every other weekend as well. So that was kind of the progression from there, and sort of how I got my little foot in the door.
Yeah. So late night anchoring, but most of us know you from early morning shows. So how'd you end up working on a morning show?
I still think this is one of the funniest things that has happened in my career. I mean, if you would have asked me in school, do you want to be a morning show host or a morning show anchor? I would have said no way. I want to be a reporter. I have zero interest in being on a morning show. But I think I didn't really know what that meant. I think when I thought of morning shows before, I thought a lot about the cooking segments and the kind of more feature type interviews.
Lifestyle.
Exactly. Yes. The lifestyle content, which I found interesting, but I was much more interested in more of the kind of harder news stories. So, but with that being said, as I was at this point still part-time and trying to get as many hours as I could, one of the kind of gaps I noticed at the station was that there was no one to fill in for the morning news anchor. And she was also a co-host on CTV Morning Live in Halifax. So I just asked to train to backfill her, and purely out of I want more hours because, I'd like to be able to comfortably pay my rent mostly. And so I trained with her, and then I just loved it. I love that I got to do news still. Like, I was still a news anchor, but then I also got to participate in some of these fun segments. I really enjoyed the banter between all of the hosts. And I felt like I really got to connect with people, because on a morning show, you're sharing a lot about your personal life too. So, I would talk about my cat, for example, and then, share a picture. And then other people would send me pictures of their cats and tell me their own stories. And I just really love that connection I got to build with viewers too. And just the feedback that I would get from them, it made me feel really connected. So all of these things I just really didn't know about being on a morning show kind of really started to fill all of these interests and things that I didn't even know I would really enjoy.
Mm-hmm. So you're working on this local morning show in Halifax, and then how do you end up on CTV's national morning show in front of the whole country?
So my theme of, kind of looking for opportunities and kind of ways to open doors, I guess, continues here. So the CTV had just launched a new national morning show to replace Canada AM. And what they would do is they would email the local stations once in a while and ask a reporter who was filing something for the 6 o'clock news to just file a slightly different version of it for them to use in the morning. And a lot of times the reporters at CTV Atlantic, they didn't have time. They were busy. They've been working all day. And so to ask them to stay until 7 or later to do something extra, a lot of them just didn't have time. So I decided, why don't I offer to come in early the next morning and file that whatever they're looking for ahead of their morning show. So just for a little context.
Because when you say earlier, because you're already getting in at what time for that morning show?
Yeah, like I would get there about 4:45.
Right. So earlier was getting there at what time then?
Like 4 to 4:15.
Whew, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So yeah, and thank you. I'm glad you asked that because yes, they were very very early mornings. I tried to be in bed by like 7:30 or 8 because I had to do my hair and makeup and everything obviously too before I got in. Yeah. So I would come in and this would be like a couple of times a week they would ask me to do something like this, and as I started doing that a little bit more regularly, I started to get to know some of the producers there, and I really always wanted to end up in Toronto. Cam, you and I both know when it comes to the media, it's the place to be, right? It's kind of the hub of activity. It's where most of the jobs are. And I was also really excited to be in maybe a more diverse city as well. So I started to ask them, can you guys give me some advice? What do you think I can do to make myself, more hireable in a larger market like Toronto? And they gave me some great advice. And then the best thing they did for me was ask me to fill in for a few days over Christmas in 2017. And like I cried when they asked me. It was much more than I could have ever hoped for.
So you flew to Toronto just to fill in for those 2 days and then went back home to Halifax.
So I did, it was right after Christmas. So I actually was home to spend Christmas with my family there in
Okay.
St. Catharines. So then I came to Toronto right after, and I filled in from Boxing Day to the 28th. So 3 days. I didn't sleep, honestly, those
Yeah.
3 days. I was just up the whole
You
time.
were just buzzing, right?
Yes, so much adrenaline. And
Yeah.
I still remember walking into that building, 299 Queen Street West. I mean, it's the building I grew up seeing on Much Music, on TV, and it was a pretty surreal experience.
It is, right? It is. And full disclosure, Priya and I almost crossed paths on that show. I left that show pretty much a few months maybe before she came on. So we worked on the same show, but at different times. So then there was a big announcement which led to you getting on the show on a more permanent basis.
Yes. So after those few days, I went back to Halifax and I was like, okay, so what do I do now? I mean, I just, yeah, I just had this amazing experience. I had this kind of taste of being on the national stage alongside these veteran journalists that I had admired so much, and now I'm kind of back at my job in Halifax. So what do I do now to take the next step? And as I was thinking about that, the anchor that I had filled in for, Lindsay DeLuce, she announced that she was pregnant, and so that was in February. So I guess probably about six weeks after I got back, maybe 6 or 8 weeks. So of course I applied for the job. But I definitely didn't feel like I'm for sure going to get this, So I also still remember very vividly getting that phone call. I was actually at work. So I went at CTV Atlantic, a lot of the editing booths are up a set of stairs. So I went into one of the editing booths and closed the door so no one could hear me. I took this phone call. I was offered the job. And I should say I had flown back to Toronto to do the interview. And then I guess a few weeks later, I got this phone call. And I was just absolutely elated. But the last thing that I was told on the call was, you cannot tell anyone.
Yeah.
So, of course. So I had to collect, well, of course I could tell my partner and everything. I did, yes. So I did, the first phone call I made was to Duncan, and then I told my parents, and then I left the booth and had to pretend that nothing was happening.
Happened. So this was a huge turning point.
It really was. I should mention that at this point in my career, I was struggling a little bit, a lot really with some of the challenges I was facing in Halifax. I was the only person of color on air for most of my time there. It was really hard for me. And, I was dealing with a lot of microaggressions, gaslighting, some kind of just straight out racism. And I had kind of decided that if I didn't get this job in Toronto, I was going to look for another career. Even though I really loved my work, some of these external factors were just starting to really weigh on me.
Yeah. Can you talk, if you're comfortable, a little bit more about what you experienced? Because I think sometimes it's good for people to hear them, not just to validate that these things happen, but for the people they're happening to. Sometimes when we don't talk about these things, we feel like they're just all in our heads and they're not real.
You are so right, Camille. And that's how I felt for a lot of my time there. It took me so long to really figure out what was happening, to be honest. But absolutely, I can think of a few times when I pitched stories about diverse populations, for example, and I was told things like, I don't think our audience would be interested in that. Or times when I would question an editorial decision. Why are we mentioning the race of a person in a story when it isn't relevant to the story? And I was told, you're being too sensitive. There were also some more obvious signs. Ironically, my first full-time job as the news anchor on CTV Morning Live, I was actually replacing another woman of color. And she was the only full-time on-air employee who didn't have a company phone. And it just never made sense. The reason given was, well, you're always at your computer. But all of the other anchors and hosts all had company phones, and they were also often at their computers. So when I got the job, I had to bring up the issue for about a year until I finally got a phone. And for all of you who are listening, you might think, well, these are such small things. Like, couldn't you just ignore them? But I'm just really giving you a few examples. But these kinds of things were happening regularly. And I didn't have anyone who I could turn to and say, that comment was discriminatory, right? Or someone who would have my back when I stood up for a story about a story about diversity, or when I tried to question an editorial decision. I didn't have anyone who would stand up with me, and it was really hard. I often, when I'm trying to explain it to someone who maybe hasn't experienced discrimination or racism, I say, it's like getting a paper cut every day. You get one paper cut and you kind of can let it heal. But when you're getting one every day, eventually the one before doesn't have time to heal. And, it just is kind of this piling up of pain. And eventually it gets to be a lot and can really take a toll on your mental health. And I've spoken to a lot of other journalists of color who I know have similar experiences. And Camille, I know you and I have shared some of our mutual experiences too.
What's at risk when you think about speaking up in the moment when these things are happening?
Yeah, this was really hard for me. I was never really in a position of power. I always was worried I would lose my job. At first there was no way I was going to risk losing my job, of course. So I tried to choose my battles, and, be really conscious of when I would stand up for something, and also to think about the emotional toll it was going to take on me. Because when you do take the time to try and explain to someone why something is racist, and then they dismiss you and nobody else stands up with you, it starts to take a toll on your self-confidence too. So, another example of that happening is when I actually got the job in Toronto. I had another colleague who had also applied for the same position, and she was white. And as I was telling my bosses that I got the job, the first thing I was told was, if you could just temper your excitement, that would be really helpful, because we're worried about this other person feeling bad that they didn't get the job.
Wow. So make yourself small so that her fragility stays intact.
Exactly. That's exactly what it felt like.
Oh, that's tough. And then you have all this excitement, you're going to Toronto, and I'm going to bet that you felt like, I'm moving to a big city, things are going to be so much better.
I really, really did. And, but before I left the station in Halifax, I actually did have a conversation with a manager there because at this point I did feel like I have nothing to lose because I have this job in Toronto. And so I actually did have a conversation with a manager where I was very honest about the racism and the discrimination and the editorial problems that were stemming from some of these issues. And that manager asked me, a lot of it was related to one specific person. And that manager asked me, do you think that person can change? And to me, that's not the question to ask. What I wanted to hear is, I'm sorry that you're going through this. I'm sorry this is happening to you. Just acknowledge it. And then what you do about it, you're the manager. That's up to you. But asking me if I think someone can change, I mean, I don't know. And I just felt even in that moment that it was dismissed. So to go back to your question though, yes, when I moved to Toronto, I was really hoping for a fresh start and hoping that moving to a more diverse city, I would have different experiences. But I also started that job feeling like I didn't deserve to be there. When I told a lot of people I got the job, a lot of them said, oh yeah, well, you're a diverse candidate and they need some diversity there. And really kind of, really minimize the fact that I got this job in the first place. And when enough people tell you those things, you start to believe it. And as I look back, I know I just explained, like, I was coming in early. I was doing these extra stories. I was working hard to meet people. Like, I know all of that now. And I know I deserved that job. But at the time, I wasn't able to be objective about it. And I just started to believe the things that I was hearing from the people around me. So I didn't have a lot of confidence when I was starting that position. And, it was a lot of the same issues there. There were still regular microaggressions and gaslighting. There was no diversity in management or in editorial positions, actually at any of the stations I worked at during my career. And that's challenging because those are the people making the final decisions, of course. For anyone who is listening and watching, the people you see on TV aren't the ones most of the time who are making the decisions, the editorial decisions. They're kind of being told by someone else what to do. And a lot of the people in those decision-making positions are white. There just isn't a lot of diversity there. And also for me, I kind of had the added pressure of being on a short-term contract. So making me really vulnerable, right? You can be let go at any moment. So yeah. At one point, somebody made an accusation about me that wasn't true, but I wasn't even given a chance to tell my side of the story. And this is something I've heard from a lot of people of color. It happens. Somebody makes a complaint about you or says something happened. And if that person is white, they're automatically believed over the person of color. And the person of color doesn't even get an opportunity to share their side of the story. So that led me to a period of about 2 weeks when I would stay up all night crying. I would go in, I would stop crying, do the morning show, go back to my office, I would cry again. And eventually I realized I needed help. And thankfully I was in a position to be able to afford counseling. And I needed it. That was the only thing that got me through that period of time. And I'm purposely not naming any names here because I don't want that to take away from this interview. I don't want that to be the takeaway from this interview maybe there are a few bad apples, because that's not the case. These are industry-wide problems. Any journalists of color listening, I'm sure you're nodding along and maybe feeling heard.
Yep.
Yeah. These incidents happened at every station I worked at, and on top of the challenges that, already exist for women in general.
I'm going to take a deep breath because so much is coming back to me now. Yeah. So at the beginning, you mentioned that some of you wanting to even tell this story came from you thinking about what to tell young women of color when they ask for advice. I get a lot of young women of color too asking me about getting to the media business. And there's some times when I'm like, oh my gosh, am I going to come off as like this like negative, person who's so bitter and is like, but at the same time, I have to find a way to tell them what to expect. Cause I feel like, if my child, asked me about something, I couldn't just be like, it's amazing. Yeah, you got to do it. Just work hard and you'll make it. I feel like that's a lie. So how do you respond to people when they ask you for advice about the industry?
Oh, Cam, I feel the exact same way. This is when I really started to think about sharing my story. When I left, I had no intention of of ever telling anyone any of this. I really just wanted it to go away. I wanted to forget about it. And quite frankly, I was a little bit embarrassed in some ways, which I realize now that I shouldn't have been. But, here I was on national TV and I was going home and crying every day. Like I just had such a hard time kind of reconciling all of the things that were happening to me. And all of that really did kind of come together when all of these young women started asking me for advice. And like you said, you don't want to discourage someone, but at the same time, you feel a responsibility to be honest. And so as I thought about it, what I finally started to tell a lot of them was, listen, it's an industry where you will likely face racism and discrimination, whether it's in your own newsroom, whether it's when you're out in the field doing stories. So the thing that helped me the most when I was having the hardest time was having other journalists of color that I could lean on, other friends who had similar experiences. As awful as it is, it was comforting to know that it wasn't just me. So my advice now is to find those people who are going to have similar experiences as you. And that goes for members of, the LGBTQ plus community as well. Any time you're part of a diverse population, find other people who will have the same experiences as you. And, if you're lucky, find some allies too, who maybe will stand up for you. I did have some of those along the way. And the hard part is having allies who maybe are in the same position as you, where maybe they don't have the power to stand up either. But definitely I'd say, find your people and hopefully find some good allies along the way too, because you will need them. And there will be those hard days.
So then deciding to leave journalism was another big turning point for you. That when I left journalism, mainstream media news, it was hard. What was it like for you?
It was really hard. It was sad and honestly, it was heartbreaking. I mean, I had worked my whole life for this job and to be, working in Canada's biggest city. I never stopped loving my work the whole time. Even when all of these other things were happening, I always loved the work. But I just couldn't handle all of that discrimination and the toll it was taking on me. So eventually, I got to that point where the scale kind of tipped and I realized I needed to leave. I really wasn't sure I was making the right move, but as soon as, obviously this is where you really came in and you helped me to get a job in tech at Hootsuite. And as soon as I started working at Hootsuite and found a healthier work environment, I really realized how unhappy I had been and how much better things could be. And it really allowed me this time and the space that I needed to heal from everything that had happened.
I remember we chatted right before, and I remember sharing with you that when I finally quit, what was so hard for me was realizing that I had absolutely equated my self-worth with my identity as a journalist. And the thing that hit me the day after I quit was, if I'm not a journalist, like, what am I? What worth am I? What value am I? Why would I do this? I should go back, and whereas you were very intentional about leaving, what's scary to me is that if someone hadn't approached me about leaving, I literally would have just stayed the course, because at that time, I truly didn't believe I could do any better, like truly.
I know the feeling. I mean, especially, I know you had very similar experiences to me. I mean, you start to doubt your own self-worth and your own value when you're in those positions. And for me, one of the greatest things that had happened after I left was just regaining my self-confidence. I I had lost all of it. And when I started my career, I was eager and excited, and I was, full of energy, and I felt like I could do anything. And by the end, I really didn't feel any of that. So it was really hard. And also to have, like you said, a job that's so tied to your identity. I mean, I felt the same way. People would recognize me from the shows and want to talk about something that I had talked about on the show, or even just meeting new people. As soon as you say you work in television, you know what it's like. People, it's interesting, right? So that part was a really big shift. And in a way, it was a good reminder to me to find other things that made me happy and to not rely on my career, right? To fill all of those buckets.
Absolutely. And so, it's been 2 years later now. You got your own show. Now you're still working in tech somewhere else. Any regrets? Are you happy?
This is the happiest I've been, for sure. I found a way to still do journalism, of course, with this show, with Turning Point, but it's on my own terms. I don't have to deal with the external factors that were making me miserable. I love hearing different Turning Point stories. We all have them. The idea for the show was really inspired by my love of these kinds of stories in journalism, and of course, my own turning points as well. But it really does, it just makes me so happy to be doing this, to be doing it on my own terms. We hit 40,000 downloads recently, which was a huge milestone too. And I know I said this before, but just my self-confidence is back. That is the best part for me. When I look back at the person that I was at the end of my time in journalism, I mean, I was angry, I was frustrated, I was constantly doubting myself. And that's what dealing with those microaggressions and discrimination on a regular basis, that's what it does to you over time. It really wears you down. So I'm so happy to be out of that and to be in a place now where I can look back. I can say that I've learned a lot, and I feel like I can offer my experience to other people and hope that it might help them on their own journeys.
So you learned a lot, and people are learning through your learning. We made it. I made it without grabbing my tissues. Okay. I made it without a tear. It got close. But
for me too.
And I am so honored that you asked me to interview you. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Cam. And thank you for everything that you've done for me. I know that we have shared pieces of our own stories along the way, but you really became a lifeline for me when I decided to leave. And, you really showed me the way in this new career in tech, and you kind of threw me a lifesaver when I really needed it. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your leadership when it comes to racial equity, and I'm so grateful for your friendship. And thank you. I couldn't think of anyone else who I would have rather had this conversation with. I just so appreciate you doing this and being here and supporting me along the way too.
Anytime, sis.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you who have been watching and listening this season. I can't believe this is episode 25 already and a wrap on season 1. Thank you for listening to my own story today. I would love to hear from all of you after too. So send me a DM on Instagram, on Twitter, wherever you are on social media. I can't wait to see all of you back for season 2. We've already got some really exciting things planned. So keep an eye on our social media channels for that. And until then, take good care of yourselves and of each other.